preparing for some big transitions in the coming weeks. Of course, the one is we're excitedly looking forward to moving out of our apartment into a home. But the other one is that our three oldest are preparing to go to school in September. And one of the ways that the school is helping our family get ready is one of the things that they do with new families is to have a dinner, invite new families to come, and then introduce the administrative staff, but also try to prepare people for what is coming. And so a big part of this dinner that we went to was the principal getting up in front and sharing what we should expect for the coming year. Expectations matter, and often we're disappointed or angered by expectations rather than finding out what we should know is coming and adjusting accordingly. Well, this principal's heading into her 5th year. She's learned what's helpful to share and what families need to hear, whether we accept it or not, I guess is a whole nother matter. But she was going through, actually one of the places that she said she received the most negative feedback, the most complaints from parents, and it was regarding pickup from school. It wasn't regarding the education or the teachers, the program. It was regarding picking up children from school. And if you've ever been to Triumph and seen the parking lot there, it does present challenges when you have hundreds of students that are being picked up in a short amount of time. And so the day ends at a certain time, and for that 10 minutes, it's just, I guess, chaos. We get to experience it for the first time very soon. And she said sometimes people would show up as early as before 2 o'clock in the afternoon just to be first in line and ready to pick up kids. I guess you can listen to an audiobook, or these days you can stream stuff in your car, I don't know, but it's a big deal to people. They are seeking help from outside the school in order to design the pickup better. And that's how big of a deal this is. Good designing is not easy. Good designing takes a lot of time, and often connected with that, good designing takes a lot of money. It is not something that we attain easily. One of the more difficult things for me, as I've been now a new resident of Monroe for a little over a year, has been driving Telegraph every day. But what on Telegraph would be frustrating? The red lights. They don't design and understand why I'm bringing this up, so I'm not trying to use this as just a complaint session, but they don't design the road to have traffic flow through. They design the road to have traffic stopping routinely. And why do they do that? Well, the more that I've heard from people, that's just a dangerous road, and there are accidents that happen that are just brutal. And so they want people stopping and slowing down so that it's safer as they drive on the road. The road still tests my patience, but knowing that helps me understand why I'm just getting up to the speed limit and then stopping, and then just getting up and stopping again. Well, that's been designed that way for my safety and for the safety of other people. We could give other examples of simple or complex situations that show the need for intentional designing in the world around us. But my point is that sometimes we struggle to operate or live within the systems that we do that others have put in place. So somebody up top, right, we use that phrase, or somebody in an office has designed something that I have to live with. And that's just a reality of life. Ultimately, whether I understand why the lights work as they do, or whether I don't understand that, doesn't change my responsibility. There are still laws I need to obey, and even beyond those laws, I still need to be driving on the road, seeking to love God and love others. Those responsibilities remain, whether I fully comprehend the source of my frustration or not. God expects me to be faithful, and there are others who expect me to be obedient as I drive on the road. We've now covered 37 chapters in the book of Job. From chapters 3 through 37, God has been silent. Now, Job has been calling on God to answer, but God has been silent during that time. And really, for the whole book, Job has never heard anything from God. The sessions in heaven, Job was not privy to. And so now we get to chapter 38, and God begins to speak. He's going to give 2 different speeches. The second speech is a defense of his justice and his rule over creation. I plan to get to that next week. The one we're looking at this week is a defense of God's design within creation. Job has accused God, complaining about his rule over the world, and God is about to put him in his place. There's no bones about it. This is meant to show Job that he is a part of creation, and he is not lord over it. And just by way of warning, speaking of expectations, this is a glorious speech. It is truly amazing. If you've read through the book and finally arrived at chapter 38, there's a sense of relief. Finally, God is speaking, and I can know that whatever he's saying is true. But there's a part here that will very likely overwhelm you as we go through these chapters. Time after time, paragraph after paragraph, example after example of God's design, of God's superiority. And you might be left gasping, so to speak, and saying, how am I to comprehend all of this? And the answer to that is exactly. That's where we should be. We should leave this passage amazed at God's greatness, at God's wisdom, at the design that he has put in creation, and looking up and saying, you are beyond me. Your wisdom, I can grasp some of it, and much of it just leaves me amazed. And so as we're going through this, and it's going to be a bit of work as we go through God's speech here, if you're going through and saying, I'm barely holding on, then maybe that gives you a little bit of an idea of where Job was at as God was speaking to him. Job was one who feared God, and without a doubt, we know that he wanted God to answer him, but also with this desire for God to speak, there was fear and trepidation. Job said in chapter 9, verses 16 and 17, if I summoned him and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice, for he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. He says in chapter 13, in several verses there, though he slay me, I will hope in him, yet I will argue my ways to his face. So you see there's a mixture of fear but longing for conversation with God. In verses 20 to 24 of Job 13, he says, only grant me two things, then I will not hide myself from your face. Withdraw your hand far from me, and let not dread of you terrify me. Then call and I will answer, or let me speak and you reply to me. How many are my iniquities and my sins? Make me know my transgressions and my sin. Why do you hide your face and count me as your enemy? So there's this turmoil that Job is just expressing of wanting to have a conversation with God, but also fearing him. So let's try to imagine this once powerful man. He's suffered terribly. His very body has been racked with illness. He's endured biting speeches from three men who claim to be his friends. He's just received rebuke from this energetic youngin as Elihu stepped forward with insightful words. He's been driven by the enduring desire to be vindicated by God, the hope that God would answer his charges and prove him innocent. It's not been easy. And then, as all of this settles before their very eyes, a whirlwind appears, and God begins to speak. Yet God is not subject to the demands of people. We don't create the context and tell God what to speak and have him speak. He chooses what he will say, and he's forced by nobody. And so at the end of the day, Job still will not have the answers that he so desperately craves, but he will leave a changed man. And his friends will leave changed as well. So again, we're only looking at the first of two speeches. In this first speech, God's focus is on his counsel or his plan or design within creation. I think you'll see as we progress through our passage that in many ways, God does not give Job the answers he wants. Job must learn that specific knowledge of God's work in his life is not what he truly needs. Job's thinking, if I only knew, if I only heard from God, and he settled the matter. But God's not going to give him that specific knowledge, and instead, Job needs to be amazed at how God has designed his world. That's our challenge today. Be amazed at how God has designed his world. Sometimes amazement is the right response, and tightly tied to worship as well. Now, usually I've been reading through a chapter at a time, and I think because of the overwhelming nature of this speech, I'm going to be reading it in sections today. Job 38:1 says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said," and this is where God begins to speak. Now back in 2 Kings 2, if you've ever heard of the prophet Elijah, one of the two men not to die during his life, God brought him up to heaven, and God used a whirlwind to accomplish that. That's in 2 Kings 2. Here God speaks out of the whirlwind. We don't need an audible response like this from God today. You don't need to be concerned that if you've been waiting for God to speak, one day you're going to walk outside and be confronted by a whirlwind or hear a voice from God. We have the completed scriptures that the Bible gives us all we need to grow to maturity and to be faithful before God. But back in Job's day, in his wisdom, God cared for his servant Job by correcting his focus and in many ways responding to what Job was saying. But as we proceed, I hope you see that God answers according, again, to what he wants Job to know, not according to what Job thinks he must know. There's a big difference between those two. So God decides to speak. He decides what he will tell his servant and what his servant needs. And then God challenges his adversary. See verses 2 and 3. "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me." These two verses are very important for understanding the rest of the speech from God. This translation in the ESV is good. I think the NIV helps us understand the bigger concept better when it says, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" God has plans, and he's seeking to accomplish those plans, and he will. But he's saying, "Who is this that is obscuring my plans with useless speech?" Well, it's Job. An important term in this verse is counsel, or as I read the NIV, plans. Psalm 33, 10 and 11 says, "The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the peoples. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations." As we proceed through this chapter and into the next, the unifying theme, I think, is God's design, or his planning in his creation. Job has questioned how God has designed his world to function, and by his answer, God rebukes him for such questioning. There are certain things that we need to accept by faith, and we have no right in messing with. Job's going to learn that here. Before we move on to his defense, I'm just going to turn over to Job 40 and read verses 1 and 2 there. This is after God has asked Job a number of questions. And verse 1 there says, "The Lord said to Job, 'Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it.'" I don't know if any of us want to be in that place of being the one who's identified as the person arguing with God. This is not an enviable position. But this is why, in labeling this section, God challenges his adversary. Job knew that he wanted to bring a case before God. That's back in chapter 23. You could see that. And it shows what he wanted. But keep in mind, at the conclusion of the first speech, God calls on the one who accused him to respond. Job is about to find out that he's brought charges against the one who's vastly and infinitely superior to him. This ought not be done. Maybe you've asked a question, you've had something you needed to figure out, so you found somebody who is very versed in that subject, and you go to that person and start asking questions, and you quickly find that their terminology is different than what you use. It's far beyond you, and so within the second sentence, you're lost. Well, Job has some things to learn, and one of those things that he needs to learn is that God's wisdom is far beyond him. So if Job is questioning how God is arranging his world and running things, he needs to see that God knows what he's doing, and Job does not. He needs to learn a lesson. And so we get to God's defense. God gives his defense. And by this, I don't mean that God needs to give to us an explanation for everything that he does. But he is going to answer Job in some ways. And you'll see more of what I'm saying as we continue. But But let's read this first section, verses 4 through 7 of Job 38, and start to see God's design in the inanimate world, or the non-living world. The second part of the speech is going to be where we look at creatures, animals, and birds. But this first part is God's design in the inanimate world, the non-living part of the world that he has made. So verses 4 to 7. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. As looking at the earth, God asks these questions. Back in chapter 9, verses 5 to 7, Job spoke of God removing and overturning mountains, shaking the earth out of its place, and keeping the sun from rising. In other words, he saw God as bringing disorder on his creation. But here in chapter 38, God asked Job where he was when he laid the foundation of the earth. Where was Job? Well, he wasn't even born at that point. He did not exist. God is the one who determined the measurements of the earth, as Job surely knows. So Job speaks of God bringing havoc upon the earth. But what does Job know? God is the very one who created the order of the earth. He's its designer. So Job says in chapter 9 that God is bringing disorder. Here in chapter 38, by his questions, God is showing he is the one who has brought order to creation. Let's read verses 8 through 11. Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Regarding the sea, then, is this next section. Job speaks several times of limits that God had imposed upon him. Did he speak positively of the limits that God had in his life? No, he did not see God's limitations as a good thing. He complained about God hedging him in so that he did not know his way in chapter 3, verse 23. He complains about the guard set over him in 7:12. And in 13:27, he states that God set a limit for the soles of his feet. I could go on to other passages, but the point is pretty clear. Job does not like the restrictions that God is putting on his life. And yet in these verses here in chapter 38, God shows that setting limits is part of what he does. And so he's the one who has set limits on the sea, where it can go and where it will not go. Setting limits is a vital and fundamental part of his rule. Let's look at verses 12 to 15. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and its features stand out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken. Job accused God of destroying both the blameless and the wicked. He accused God of mocking the innocent when they suffer calamity, and of giving the earth into the hand of the wicked. He did that in chapter 9, verses 22 to 24. In his thinking, those who provoke God are secure. In other words, the world is not as it should be. Things are upside down. The blameless suffer and the wicked prosper. He even asks in chapter 10, verse 3, does it seem good to you to oppress, to despise the work of your hands, and favor the designs of the wicked? And now God questions Job, asking if he has been the one to command the morning and cause the dawn to know its place. What does this have to do with the wicked? Well, where does wickedness thrive? Thrives in the dark. Thrives in the dark. And so as God then goes to the morning, the dawn, as light breaks out over the earth, the picture is given of, in verse 13, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it as something caught in a cloth, and you shake the cloth and that whatever it is thrown out of the cloth. So it is when light comes upon the world. The wicked can no longer hide in their wickedness and accomplish their wicked deeds. They have to scatter for some kind of covering. And so God is explaining that within the daily routine that he has fixed upon the earth, there are limits that he has put upon wickedness. The very nature of the cycle of days, God has put a check into evil to keep it in its place. Now, is that the only answer to wickedness? No, but he's trying to show through the design that he has put within the world that there are certain boundaries and limits. He knows how to keep things in their place. Verses 16 through 18. Have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. In a very somber passage back in chapter 3, verses 16 to 19, Job wishes that he had been stillborn. He saw death as a place of rest and ease. In 14:13, he viewed Sheol, or the realm of the dead, as a place where he could be safe from the wrath of God. Those are very serious things to say. But in chapter 38 here, God asked Job about the deep places of the earth, including the recesses of the sea and the gates of death. Has Job witnessed those things firsthand? Does he know by firsthand witness or firsthand experience what these places are like? Can Job truly know if he has rightly spoken of these parts of God's creation? Job, you speak as saying this is a good place to go, but have you ever been there? Do you really know what the gates of death look like, that you speak with such longing for them? Of course not. Verse 19, where is the way to the dwelling of light, and where is the place of darkness, that you may take it to its territory, and that you may discern the paths to its home? You know, for you were born then, the number of your days is great. As we get to this section, looking at light and darkness, we've seen repeatedly this theme throughout the book. In chapter 3, once again, verses 3 to 10, Job longed for the day of his birth to be turned to darkness. He wanted darkness to cover something that had been light, the day of his birth. So speaking of when he was born, he even wanted the stars of its dawn to be dark. Yet who is Job to speak to this? Does he know the place of light and darkness so that he may control them and guide them as he pleases? And so you can see the sarcasm coming through in verse 21 from God. You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. Surely you must have seen by firsthand experience if you're talking like this. The point to Job is you're talking about that of which you do not fully understand. Who are you to wish darkness on the days of your birth, the day of your birth? Job is part of creation, not the mastermind behind it. He is not the one who directs light and darkness and where they are to go. He's just a part of creation. Verses 22 to 30, look at the weather. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way to the place where the light is distributed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain, and a way for the thunderbolt to bring rain on a land where no man is, on the desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the ground sprout with grass? Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb did the ice come forth? And who has given birth to the frost of heaven? The waters become hard like stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Back in chapter 12, verses 13 to 15, Job explained how God sometimes tears down. He withholds the waters, bringing drought, or he sends waters out so that they overwhelm the land. So according to Job, God brings chaos and disorder through the weather. And, at first glance, we would agree with that. There's times when weather comes and it's just chaos. But has Job entered the storehouses of the snow, or has he seen the storehouses of the hail? In other words, does Job know what God is planning with the weather? It's using picturesque language. He doesn't have a literal storehouse of hail waiting to dump down on the earth. but is pointing to his planning and his precision in what he does with the weather. Would Job even consider what the desert needs, what a place of uninhabited by humanity would require? See, if we were in charge of things like the weather, would we even think about all the ramifications of what we did? I just want a beautiful day today. Or I just want to have 12 inches of nice snow for Christmas. And yet we don't know what that affects in other parts of the world. In other parts of Michigan, or as the weather goes through Michigan and on into the East Coast, we don't know the ramifications there. Would Job have even thought of what the desert area needs? Because there is life there, maybe not human life, but there is life. We can't even think in those kind of terms. And even if we know that there's consequences for other parts with what we experience, we don't know how to manage that to care for the other parts of the world. The weather's not haphazard. God is indeed watching over it and guiding it as he designs. Verse 31, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season? Or can you guide the bear with its children? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish the rule on the earth? Speaking to constellations. I just alluded to chapter 12, and if we're to go back there and read the end of the chapter, we'd see Job trying to bring out the apparent disorder or chaos that God sometimes brings into the world as he makes nations great and then destroys them. He overthrows the mighty and takes away understanding from the chiefs of the people of the earth. Yet who is Job to question God? Can he orchestrate the stars? Can he bring the constellations across the sky at night? Does Job even know the ordinances of the heavens? He does not. It makes me think of being outside on a crystal clear night and starting to see the stars come out. And what if you just laid down on your back, you looked up at the constellations and said, if that star was a smidge to the right, that constellation would look better. Move it over. Oh, I'd kind of like to create a new constellation over here. I don't quite see much, very bright. So let's bring out the brightness a little bit, to move star. That's totally incomprehensible to have that kind of power. And even if we did, we don't know what that would create. Oh, I didn't mean to create that big flash of light. I don't know why that happened. This is power that is so much beyond us. And so God is overwhelming Job with his wisdom, with his design within the world. Verse 33, do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on the earth? We are severely limited, and God is vastly superior in wisdom and in power. Verse 34, can you lift up your voice to the clouds that a flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth lightnings that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the inward parts or given understanding to the mind? Who can number the clouds by wisdom, or who can tilt the waterskins of the heavens when the dust runs into a mass and the clods stick fast together? So going back to the theme of weather and managing clouds, God asked Job if he can direct the clouds and rain by his voice. It quickly becomes apparent that Job does not have the needed wisdom to number and manage the clouds. Not only is his ability to manage the world woefully inadequate, but his wisdom is not sufficient for directing the affairs of the inanimate, non-living components of God's created universe. Nobody has a voice like God's. By his mere words, he can make things be. Then we come to God's design in living creatures. Starting in verse 39. Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens and lie in wait in their thicket? Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God for help and wander about for lack of food? So speaking of lions and ravens, Job accused God of hunting him like a lion in 10:16. But here, God asked Job if he can hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions. So far from stalking Job like a lion, God cares even for the carnivores, for the hunting animals. In 19:7, Job complains that his cry to God for justice is left unanswered. But here God communicates that he even hears the cry of hungry young ravens. It's not a question whether he ever heard Job. It's not a question whether he ever hears the cry of one of his people. Far beyond that, God even knows what's going on with the young birds. Not only are these questions from God showing Job how selfish and narrow his focus had become, but they're also communicating to Job that God has designed his world carefully, and he has by no means walked away from his care of it. Beware of claiming that God does not hear, believer. To do so is to speak words of unbelief. To do so is to express a lack of faith in our God. On to chapter 39, verse 1. Do you know that when the mountain goats give birth, do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth? When they crouch, bring forth their offspring, and are delivered of their young. Their young ones become strong. They grow up in the open. They go out and do not return to them. So speaking of mountain goats and does, this section then, God asks more questions of Job. Back in chapter 14, Job came up with a plan. He wanted God to hide him in the grave, in death, until God would appoint a time that he could present his case, the wrongness of his life, to God. Job thought, maybe this will work. We'll figure out a time where after I die, then God's wrath can pass, and then God and I can meet to try to figure things out. Now, that might bring up more questions in your mind. We're not going back to chapter 14 for more on that, but the helpful part of that passage is that we see Job trying to arrange a time for him and God to work through what's going on with his suffering. What does that have to do with the first part of chapter 39? God asks Job whether he knows the time when the mountain goat and the doe give birth. Here's Job trying to force God to answer in Job's timing. And here's God showing that he cares for the timing of events that Job cannot even personally witness. Do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth? In God's design, He's set limits on the sea. He's caused the dawn to know its place. He knows the paths to the homes of light and darkness. And now here He knows the timing for animals as they give birth. This too is part of His design within creation. And here's Job, trying to change rules and set up a time after death where he can meet with God. We get to the wild donkey in verse 8. Who has let the wild donkey go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I have given the arid plain for his home and the salt land for his dwelling place. He scorns the tumult of the city. He hears not the shouts of the driver. He ranges the mountains as his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. Not only has God caused the dawn to know its place, but He's given a dwelling place to the wild donkey. Now back in chapter 3 again, in his grief, Job longed for freedom, the freedom that death would bring. He thought death would bring rest and ease and freedom from one's master. But the wild donkey is not free when it is away from God, but rather when it is away from mankind. God has given the wild donkey its place, and that donkey does not chafe at God's design, but rather enjoys freedom because of His design. There's a difference. God has put the donkey in the wilderness, and within God's design, it enjoys freedom. The implications seem to be that God knows the place of beings that He has created. He surely knows Job's place, and Job's wrong to think that he must be free from God. That is not freedom as God would design it. There's a whole other category we could go into there. But we tend to think that being away from God's presence is freedom. We couldn't be farther from the truth. No, being in submission to God and how He has designed us and what He has called us to be, that is true freedom. The only other option is slavery to sin. Slavery to the ruler of the darkness of this world. On to verse 9 in chapter 39. We get to the wild ox. Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will he spend the night at your manger? Can you bind him in the furrows with ropes, or will he harrow the valleys after you? Will you depend on him because his strength is great, and will you leave to him your labor? Do you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? Back in chapter 9, verse 16, Job had said that if God answered his summons, he would not believe that God was listening to his voice. He did not believe that God was one he could trust. And now God asked Job if he could train the wild ox to where he could trust or have faith in it to do the needed work. Now, the wild ox was kind of an animal of legend. It's said, apparently, this animal at the shoulders, the width of the shoulders of a bull, was 6 feet. You weren't going to train this wild ox to plow your land. It just wasn't going to happen. You weren't going to put it in a yoke and tame it. These beasts were fearsome creatures and dangerous creatures. You couldn't domesticate them. They wouldn't have been willing to bear the yoke for plowing. This section shows more of God's design within his creation, while also showing his full awareness of Job's words of doubt. The focus on such a powerful animal and Job's inability to train it also communicates to Job how great God is and how limited his own power is. So Job didn't have faith that God would answer. And God is asking him, do you have faith in your own ability with this ox? Here's just a part of my creation. Could you tame it? Communicating God's power and Job's limited power. Then we get to the section on the ostrich. Verse 13, the wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are they the pinions and plumage of love? For she leaves her eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them and that the wild beast may trample them. She deals cruelly with her young as if they were not hers, though her labor be in vain. Yet she has no fear, because God has made her forget wisdom and given her no share in understanding. When she rouses herself to flee, she laughs at the horse and its rider. As we come to the ostrich, we come to quite a unique bird. It cannot fly, and perhaps much more seriously, it seems to have a lack of concern for its young. Although the ostriches do watch over their eggs and care for their young, their methods seem unusual and careless at first. So they're willing to leave the place of their young or their eggs, maybe to draw off a predator, but then now their young are left unprotected. So it seems that the ostrich is unusual and does not have the normal wisdom that other birds would have. God has given her no share or portion in understanding. Things are different with the ostrich. Though the ostrich has no share in understanding, God is looking to hear what Job does understand, as he says back in verse 4 of chapter 38, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." So he's given to different beings, to different creatures, different levels of wisdom and understanding for their habitat, for what's going on around them. But he's asking Job for his level of understanding. And then we get to the horse. Now, we in today's age don't understand how dangerous a weapon the horse was in those days. It was the tank of the day. Verse 19, do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like the locust? His majestic snorting is terrifying. He paws in the valley and exults in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. Upon him rattle the quiver, the flashing spear, and the javelin. With fierceness and rage he swallows the ground. He cannot stand still at the sound of the trumpet. When the trumpet sounds, he says, "Aha!" He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. God asked Job in 13:21, "Withdraw your hand far from me, and let not dread of you terrify me." Job did not want to be terrified of God, but can Job even handle the horse? This creature was a terrifying animal on the battlefield in Job's day, and verse 20 even says his majestic snorting is terrifying. The horse is a powerful creature that can be trained to go into battle with fierceness and rage. It's ready to enter the fray and doesn't turn back from the sword. But God is the creator of this animal as well. And if Job cannot even stand up to the horse on his own in battle, who is he to think that he can stand up to God? God in his greatness should strike fear into Job's heart. And in his greatness, he should strike fear into our hearts as well. So are there aspects of God's creation that strike fear into your heart? Well, consider the God who made them. Then we get to the hawk and the eagle in verse 26. Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the rock he dwells and makes his home, on the rocky crag and stronghold. From there he spies out the prey. His eyes behold it from far away. His young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there is he. Is Job the one who's designed the flights of the hawk and eagle? These birds seem the very opposite, by the way, of the ostrich. As they soar high above and they spy or they watch their prey. Job knew that God was watching him, but that was a burden to him and a cause for complaint in chapter 7. But here's another part of God's creation, that Job did not design more creatures that he neither designed nor commands. Job cried out in 16:18, O earth, cover not my blood, and let my cry find no resting place. He wanted his blood, his suffering to be evident and a witness against God. Here in the end of God's first speech, speaking of the eagle's young, he says, his young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there is he. Again, God knew all that Job had said. If there are creatures that are spilling blood, God is aware of it. How much more is he aware of the suffering of his servant? Job's words had not fallen on deaf ears, and in response, God shows his vastly superior wisdom and understanding as he shows just glimpses of how well-designed his creation truly is. And so we already read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 40, but God calls on Job to answer. In verse 3, Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. How does Job respond to God's first speech? Is this a good response? Is it a right response? He admits that he's of small account. This is kind of the opposite of having honor. God is the one who is much more honorable or full of honor, much more glorious. So who is Job to answer him? But what do we not have here? There's no confession. There's no admittance on Job's part that he had sinned. Instead, he keeps himself from another long speech. I lay my hand on my mouth. God has defended his design within creation, that his counsel and planning are vastly superior to Job's. Yet at this point, Job's spirit is not broken. Make sure we catch that. All these words from God, and yet Job is not ready to confess yet. He's not ready to humble himself before God as he should. That's for next week. So let's back up from that a little bit. What red lights has God been putting into your path? Or maybe they're detours or traffic jams or breakdowns. Whatever analogy fits your life. What have you been doubting about God's design, about his plan for your life or for the lives of those near you? The world has so many intricate moving parts. But God, in wisdom and understanding, designs and plans all things to accomplish his will. He's watching, he's working, and he will do exactly what is right and best for his glory and for the good of his people. So here's one passage that shows how fundamental and vital our faith in Genesis 1-3 is. Within Christianity, the belief that God actually created the world in 6 literal days is being left behind. Go to Genesis 1-3 and see the account of Scripture where God created everything that we have. That's being left behind. But this passage here, this speech from God, shows us all the more God's amazing creation, His design within it. It's accomplishing what He wants, what He has designed it to do. So trust in His design, in His counsel. Be amazed at how God has designed His world. And maybe you are here today and you've been fighting His design. You wouldn't say it out loud. You wouldn't say, I'm wrestling with whether God is truly a good creator and whether He is really ruling the world well. You wouldn't vocalize that. But on the inside, there's been a bitterness that has been growing. There's been doubt that has been growing, questioning. Is God really the good ruler of the world that the Bible claims He is? Is He really acting rightly in my life? Is He really managing the world? Or has He pulled His hands off? Or is He accomplishing something that is not for my good? See within this passage God's active care of His creation. He knew exactly what His servant was suffering. And so, believer, if you're secretly doubting God's design, His planning and attentiveness to your life, see in this speech from God the incredible awareness that God has of all parts of His creation. So I think Matthew 6:26 is a fitting close to the morning. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Let's pray.